Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My topic is Shia Studies as a means to widening the horizon of Islamic studies. My participation is a part of methodological studies as introduction to the conference. Konferenz für islamische Studien mit einer schiitischen Annäherung. And I want to focus my study on defamiliarization of dominant frameworks and visualization of marginal trends. As main question, I'd like to ask what can bring Shia studies for Islamic studies and how can do that? For explaining about my main question, I'd like to say that we are trying to reconsider a marginal trend as a kind of defamiliarization and the means to achieve better perceptions of familiar facts and to pass over the automated interpretations. I use the term automated interpretations, and automation is exactly the term that is used for explaining the concept of defamiliarization from the time of its formulation from the early decades of the previous century. My approach in my study today is historical analysis, and my distant scope is seeking methodological values of Shia studies for general Islamic studies as a core of this conference. The term defamiliarization that I used in the topic of my study is formulated in the early 20th century by Russian formalists, namely by Viktor Shklovsky, as technique for presenting usual and common things in a strange way, so the audiences could gain new perspectives of them. Of course, in the beginning, it was a formulation in literary studies, and it is used for studying of the literature and poetics. But I'd like to turn this concept of defamiliarization and this technique to an epistemic value for historical analysis. I studied the epistemic function of deconstruction and defamiliarization several years ago in two articles in 2004 and 2007. It is the title of these two articles, which is published less than 12 years ago. One of the things that it should be clarified before beginning our main discussion is the place of Shia in the Muslim world. Although Shia has ever been and still is a minority among Muslim population of the world, it has always played and is playing a key role in making discourses in general Islamic culture, both in elite and popular spheres. I mean that we should not judge about the place of Shia based on the population, in spite of the fact that always Shia was and is a minority among among Muslim communities, but the role played by Shia is very, very important in the course of the centuries, and it should be considered for any study about the Islam and Islamic culture in general. I'd like to underline on the place of Shia from several standpoints. Historically, Shia appearance comes back to early Islam, even the first century. Then it is as old as the Islam in general. It means that we can speak about the Shia as a community from the first century of Islamic area, and that's why along the centuries of the history of Islam, the Shia always existed, and that's why it is very important to study the Shia as a part of Islamic history along the centuries. Geographically, Shia was and is existing in major parts of Muslim world in a wide range from Central and Southern Asia to Trans-Saharan Africa. It means that Shia is existing in all the traditional territory of Muslim world, in spite of the fact that it was a minority, it was always existing and it was always present in several geographies of Muslim world. Apart from historical and geographical affairs, I'd like to come to a thematic standpoint. And I'd like to say that thematically, Shia has produced a rich heritage in different fields of culture, art, and literature, especially in some branches of knowledge, like philosophy. Shia played a key role in Islamic culture. As we know, some of the most prominent philosophers of Islam, like Avicenna, was from a Shia family. And concerning the later philosophers like Sadruddin Shirazi, known as Mullah Sadra, we know that he was grown in a Shi'i atmosphere, and he has learned in Shia circles. When speaking about the familiarization as technique, I'd like to say that we can go over this technique as several branches, techniques to reach deeper knowledge. Visualization as a kind of defamiliarization, perspectivation as a kind of defamiliarization, and detection of external material also as a kind of defamiliarization. It means that I want to discuss today about three techniques of defamiliarization: visualization, perspectivation, and detection of external material. Let's begin with speaking about visualization. Visualization is providing condition which turns an invisible fact to be evident and make the ground for unseen fact to become visible. This may be achieved by discovering the context or counter statements. When we speak about discovering the context, it means that we can consider Shia and Shi'i heritage as a context for some responses to that in Sunni circles. And it may be in reverse. Sunni heritage may be a context for appearing some Shia texts and Shia arguments as text. It means that Shia culture may play the role of context for Sunni culture, and Sunni culture may play the role of context for Shia culture. And I will give you samples and examples for two kinds. And when speaking about the counter statements, I'd like to say that it is the issue of dialogues between Shia and Sunni scholars. When we are a statement from a Sunni scholar, that is caused to creating a counter statement from the side of Shia scholars. We are going to have some examples for all of these. Speaking about the Shia and Sunni culture being contexts for another, it means that we are coming across with a thing like a mirror. Shia as a mirror for Sunni culture and Sunni sphere as a mirror for Shia culture. It is a reciprocal situation between these two cultures in connection with each other. For example, when we go to discuss about Shia as mirror to Sunni culture, we can make an example like Shia's reaction to 7 readings, al-qira'at al-saba. We know that in the beginning of the Hijri 4th century, it means in 10th century AD, some Sunni scholars like Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid created the theory of the 7 readings. It means that they tried to canonize the reading of the Quran and to restrict these canonized readings to only 7 readings. Of course, the 7 readings is well known for all researchers in the field of Islamic studies. We know that exactly from the time of creating the theory of 7 readings, it means from the beginning of the 4th century AH, we have some counter statements and we have some reactions from the side of Shi'i scholars and Shi'i circles. For example, a contemporary to Ibn Mujahid was a Shi'i scholar known as Muhammad ibn Bahr Ruhni from the city of Kerman in Iran. He has discussed the issue of 7 readings in one of his books named Muqaddimatu Ilm al-Quran, Introductions to the Quranic Sciences. And then in that work, Introduction of the Quranic Sciences, Ruhni discussed and criticized the theory of 7 readings of his contemporary Ibn Mujahid and tended to the fact that we cannot restrict the canonical readings only to 7 because of the fact that there is no meaningful difference between these 7 readings and other readings that haven't been canonized by Ibn Mujahid. It was the position not only of Ruhni, but also the position of other Shi'i scholars too, from that time to these times. Nowadays, we can read in the book Al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran of the well-known contemporary scholar, Shi'i scholar, Sayyid Abul Qasim Khui, the late authoritative of Najaf. We read there that he has also a same kind of criticism about the theory of the seven readings. And he also discussed that there is no meaningful difference and there is no meaningful advantage for these 7 readings comparing other readings from other qaris, other readers of the Quran. It is a good example, a good sample for studying the context of the discussions in Shia circles when comparing between the contents of the book of Ruhni, Muqaddimatu Ilm al-Quran, and Kitab al-Sab'a of Ibn Mujahid. We realize that it was a great struggle between the scholars of Muslim world in that century. It was not just the position of Shia scholars like Rohni and so on, but there were several other Sunni scholars too that they are opposed to the position of Ibn Mujahid, in spite of the fact that during the centuries, the position of Ibn Mujahid and his theory of 7 readings was normalized and was recognized as the unique canonical viewpoint about the readings, but the position of the scholars in the time of Ibn Mujahid was negative to this formulation. Then, speaking about the history of the 7 readings and about the history of Quranic sciences, we can use the Shia's resources, and namely the Kitab Muqaddimat Ilm al-Quran of Muhammad ibn Bahr Rohni as a source for showing the fact that in that part of history, the time of Ibn Mujahid and the time of Rohni, there was a great struggle about the canonization of the 7 readings. Let's go to another example for Shia as mirror, and to study the Shia's reaction to the idea and concept of Ara'ayt. The concept of Ara'ayt was the root of the school of Ashab al-Ra'i. We know that from beginning of the 2nd century AH, some scholars began to speak about the jurisprudential issues, al-masail al-fiqhiyya, about the jurisprudential issues, according to their own opinion and according to their own arguments, meaning ra'i, al-ra'i. And we know that from the canonical traditions narrated from the Imams of Shia, they are opposed to the usage of ra'i in conclusion and in arguments of jurisprudence. In this connection, we have a tradition from Imam Sadiq, the 6th Imam of Shia, reported in the book of Al-Kafi, written by Al-Kulayni, which says, "Lasna min ara'ayt fi shay'." Ara'ayt is not our concern. We don't care about the method of Ara'ayt. It means that they began to oppose to the usage of ra'i in jurisprudence from the beginning of the 2nd century. It is Shia's reaction to the trend of Ara'ayt from the beginning of the 2nd century, and that's why we can use these records and these accounts from Imam Sadiq and other Imams of Shia for studying the history of development of Ashab al-Ra'i in the 2nd century. We can use such account like this, Lasna min ara'ayt fi shay', for making clear the roots of Ashab al-Ra'i and the roots of using Ra'i in jurisprudence from the beginning of that century. Besides, we know the reaction of the Shia Imams and Shia scholars about the method of analogy, in Arabic, method of qiyas, and even about the method of istihsan that is began to be used from the 2nd century. For example, in an ancient text recorded as Kitab Tafsir al-Nu'mani. We read, وأما الرأي على من قال بالرأي وأما الرد على من قال بالرأي والقياس والاستحسان والاجتهاد إلى آخره. It means that this text, narrated from Shia scholars of 3rd century, is opposed to the usage of ra'i, usage of analogy, usage of istihsan and ijtihad in jurisprudential issues. And according to this account and this text, we can say that the process of istihsan, which is began from the second half of the 2nd century, was opposed by Imami scholars and Shia scholars from the beginning. It means that it was a big struggle between the scholars in that time about the innovation of some jurists like Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani for istihsan. We know that istihsan in Hanafite school means passing over an evident qiyas to come to an latent qiyas. It is a very special kind of qiyas, and it means that these struggles was very important for the Imami scholars in the 3rd century. And that's why we can use such texts like Tafsir al-Nu'mani from the 3rd century AH to discover the historical struggles between the scholars of several different schools of jurists in the 3rd century about the issue of istihsan and this innovation of Hanafite jurists. Speaking about the Shia in mirror, in reverse, we have spoken about the Shia as mirror, and now we are speaking about the Shia in mirror. It means that this time Sunni texts and Sunni culture may play the role of mirror for studying Shia. Then we can find, for example, the reaction to Shia's positions in Sunni creed books. For example, opinions in attributes of God quoted from early Shia theologians, such as Hisham ibn Hakam, in resources like Maqalat al-Islamiyyin of al-Ash'ari, may be a good instance for this kind of relationship between scholars of Shia and Sunni circles. This time, Shia is seen in the mirror of Sunni scholars and Sunni texts. Speaking about the Shia in mirror, I want to take your attention to some reactions to Shia opinions and Shia teachings in Sunni texts and Sunni culture. For example, reaction to Shia's Ashura ceremonies can be followed in some counter ceremonies in radical Sunni circles. We can find out that in some extreme Sunni circles from the 5th century AH, it means 11th century AD, we can come across with some counter ceremonies that tries to make the day of Ashura as a fest, as a festival, opposing to the Shia ceremonies of mourning in Ashura. Then we can see that this reverse ceremonies of radical Sunni circles can play the role of a mirror to show us the image of Ashura in Shia circles in those times. Further, speaking about Shia in mirror, I'd like to underline the information about Bakriya as an extremist sect trying to reproduce Shia's patterns of imamate and imam's virtues, manaqib literature, for early caliphs, especially for two early caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar ibn Khattab, such as believing in Abu Bakr's succession according to nomination of the Prophet. We know that in the mainstream of Sunni theology, they don't believe that the succession of the Holy Prophet should be by nomination. And they don't claim that the succession of Abu Bakr for the Holy Prophet is according to a nomination. It is not the mainstream of the theology of Sunni schools, not Ash'ari school and not Mu'tazili school. Such a believing is just attributed to a marginalized school of Bakriya that they claim a nomination or nas, just like the nomination claimed by Shia schools about the successorship of Imam Ali directly after the Holy Prophet. You can see here that it is the reproduction of Shia patterns for imamate and an analogy to that for the first caliph of the Holy Prophet, Abu Bakr. We can find out a detailed information about the sect of Bakriya and about their opinions in Shia texts and Shia resources. And there is very little and very, very small part of information about this sect in Sunni books, even in the books and texts of heresiography. Speaking about the sect of Bakriya, we can find out some analogical hadiths concerning the virtues of imams, such as the hadith Abu Bakr wa Umar Sayyida Kuhula Ahl al-Jannah, which is made according to the pattern of Al-Hasan wal Hussein Sayyida Shabab Ahl al-Jannah. Such a hadith is quoted, for example, in the introduction of Sudo ibn Qutayba's Al-Imamatu wa Siyasa as a hadith from the Prophet, Abu Bakr wa Umar Sayyida Kuhula Ahl al-Jannah, and it was an introduction for speaking about the history of caliphs in the book Al-Imamatu wa Siyasa. I don't want to criticize. Another time, I'd like to say that my position is neutral, and I just want scientifically to say that Sunni texts may play the role of a mirror for Shia culture, and Shia texts may play the same role for studying the Sunni culture. Now I'd like to speak about the perspectivation. When speaking about perspectivation, it is providing an additional viewpoint by the side of common sites to lead a perspective, multidimensional image of the facts, which gives us more detailed and more accurate information about something. Let's begin with the cultural religious issues. For example, Shia's perspective to compilation of the Quran. We are coming across with the neglection of the place of Imam Ali's codex in this regard in common accounts. For example, when reading the accounts about the compilation of the Quran in a classical text like Al-Itqan of Imam Jalaluddin As-Suyuti, there is explained just the role of the codex prepared by Zayd ibn Sabit in the time of the Caliph Abu Bakr, and after that in the process of its completion and the supplementary process by Zayd ibn Sabit in the time of the third Caliph Usman. But there is no mention about the place of Imam Ali's codex in this process, as well as in some Orientalistic researches, such as that of Harald Motzki about the process of compilation of the Quran. While reading the Shia texts and Shia resources, we find out that one of the first companions of the Holy Prophet tried to collect the Quran in one codex was Imam Ali. And that's why we can use the Shi'i accounts to complete the image of the process of collection of the Quran using using both kinds of resources, Sunni resources and Shi'i resources, as supplementary to each other. Further, I'd like to speak about the process of desacralization issues. Desacralization and sometimes profanation of issues considered sacred in Sunni circles, which is occurred in Shia texts and Shia resources, such as criticism of early caliphs' political and religious positions and deeds, which is not findable in Sunni resources. It is very rare to find such a criticism, but it is existing in Shia resources. I don't want to say that all the information findable in Shi'i resources about the early caliphs is confirmable. I don't want to say that. I want to say that methodologically, we can use the information given in the Shi'i resources as supplementary resources to the Sunni resources, and to judge scientifically about the facts shown in these two kinds of resources. Of course, when we speak about the history and about the scientific historical approach to the early history of Islam, this desacralization of the issues is very important for us methodologically. Further, we can point out to the rejecting the theory of full justness of the Prophet's companions, Adalatul Sahaba. We can point out to criticism of sacral place of the 7 readings and denying its being by revelation and believing in its terrestrial origin. This is 2 samples for desacralization of the issues in the Shia resources. And as I said, we need to some kind of desacralization of these issues to judge about them and to analyze them as historical facts. That's why using the Shia resources is very important and maybe useful for making a balance and equilibrium between 2 kinds of resources. I don't want to say that we can confirm all the data given in the Shia resources. I want to say that scientifically and methodologically studying, we should make a balance and equilibrium between the content of Shia resources, these sacralized, and the Sunni resources with a sacral value. Further, I'd like to speak about the detection of external material, which could be found in Shia resources. As one of the techniques of defamiliarization, we should pay attention to Sunni layers embedded in Shia texts and external non-Shi'i material internalized in Shia's heritage. For example, I'd like to point out two special decrees of old jurists such as Ibn Jurayj, the well-known jurist of Mecca, in fields such as concubinage and inheritance laws. In later resources of jurisprudence, we can find such decrees is filtered and not mentioned. For example, in books like Al-Ifsah of Ibn Hubayra, in the books like Bidayatul Mujtahid of Ibn Rushd, and other comparative resources of Sunni jurisprudence, such decrees of old jurists are filtered. And that's why we can use the content in Shia resources as a very valuable resource of such data, even for studying the decrees of old jurists of Sunni schools, especially in Shia comparative works of jurisprudence such as Sayyid Murtaza's Al-Intisar and Sheikh Tusi's Al-Khilaf, two works which are full of quotations from the old jurists of Sunni schools, which can, some of them can rarely be found in usual and classical books of comparative jurisprudence. In continuation of our discussion about detection of external material, I'd like to speak about the ideas and literature of Mu'tazili school, which is reflected in Shia resources, especially in the circles of Zaydiyya, as well as Baghdad school of Imami theologians like Sheikh Mufid and Sayyid Murtaza. Then the Shia resources is very, very rich resource for finding out the ideas and the opinions in the field of theology of Mu'tazili school. Also, the Shia circles has preserved some texts of Mu'tazili school. For example, a very important text of Abu Muslim Isfahani entitled Tafsir al-Quran in the field of Quranic exegesis. It is narrated by Isnad in Shi'i circles, which is reflected in Al-Ijazatul Kabira of Allama al-Hilli and quoted several times by Ibn Tawus in his book Sa'd al-Su'ud and some other works of him. Also, I can speak about the information about the theological extreme trends such as Bakriya and Barbahariya, etc., as well as some critical data quoted for Shu'ubi resources like Ibn al-Kalbi, Abu Ubaida, Ma'mar ibn Muthanna, and other Shu'ubi resources, which is reflected in Shia texts and Shia literature. Another important case for usage of Shia resources, you can hear me. Can you hear me? Mrs.
Yeah,
Karen?
I can hear you, and
Okay,
your sound is clear, but someone microphone is on.
Okay. I continue my discussion about the detection of external material, and I'd like to point out to Sunni literature forgotten or underestimated by Sunni circles and surprisingly preserved in Shia circles. That's why we can use Shia resources for studying this kind of the Sunni literature. For example, the Fitan literature and a wide range of works concerning the early struggles and challenges in Muslim community. We know that fitan literature, al-fitan, with an apocalyptic approach, includes several prominent works such as Al-Fitan of Nu'aym ibn Hammad, Al-Fitan of Abu Yahya Zakariya ibn Yahya, and Al-Fitan of Abu Salih as-Salili. Kitab al-Fitan of Nu'aym ibn Hammad is underestimated by Sunni scholars, in spite of the fact that Shia scholars always considered it as an important resource and quoted its content in their works. For example, in the book of Al-Malahim wal-Fitan of Ibn Tawus, we can find 1/3 of the content of the book quoted from the book of Fitan from Nu'aym ibn Hammad. And also, we come across with 2 books of Fitan from Abu Yahya Zakariya ibn Yahya and Abu Salih as-Salili, 2 Sunni scholars, which their books is not preserved and it is not are not considered in Sunni circles, but just the only preservation of their contents is in Shia circles. For example, in very developed quotations in the book of Al-Malahim wal-Fitan of Ibn Tawus and some other Shia resources. Further, I'd like to speak about some appreciated figures which are belonging to the Sunni circles, but they are underestimated in Sunni circles, and they are considered as important in Shia resources. For example, some scholars which gained special appreciation by Imamiyya, such as Al-Qadi al-Quda'i, a Shafi'i judge of Egypt, because of his position towards Ahlul Bayt. He has written a book entitled Dustur Ma'alim al-Hikam, including hadiths and sayings from Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, which was very important in Shia circles, and it is printed by the Shia editors and Shia scholars. This appreciation of Shia scholars about the figure of Qadi al-Quda'i contaminated to his other work, Shihab al-Akhbar, which is just including the hadith of the Holy Prophet. And there is no concern in this work of Qadi al-Quda'i with the special interests of Imami school and interests of Shia, but because of the fact that Shia scholars overestimated and respected the position and the figure of Al-Qadi al-Quda'i, they paid attention to his other work, Shihab al-Akhbar too. We can find out its transmission in the Shia circles with isnads. For example, we can find these isnads in the book Al-Fihrist of Muntajib al-Din al-Radhi and Al-Ijazatul Kabira of Allama al-Hilli. And its quotations may be found in several books, such as the works of Ibn Tawus. Also, we can find out several commentaries on Shihab al-Akhbar of Qadi al-Quda'i by greatest scholars of Shia, such as Qutb al-Din Rawandi, Ziya al-Din Rawandi, Burhan al-Din Hamdani al-Qazvini, Sheikh Abu al-Futuh al-Razi, and Ali ibn Zayd al-Bayhaqi. It shows that the figure of Al-Qadi al-Quda'i and his work Shihab al-Akhbar gained a very, very prominent place in Shia circles. In continuation of detection of external material, I'd like to point out to some other appreciated figures and works like Manaqib Ali ibn Abi Talib of Ibn al-Maghadili al-Wasiti, which is just preserved by Shia circles, and it is not preserved in Sunni circles, in spite of the fact that the author was a Sunni scholar. And it is there is some narrations with isnads of this book, and even some quotations by Allama al-Hilli and Ibn Tawus and so on, and some others. And we have two editions of this book, which both of them are made by Shia scholars, Muhammad ibn Baqir Behbudi and Muhammad Baqir Behbudi and Muhammad Kazim Mahmudi, two Shia scholars. And there is no any Sunni edition of this book. I don't want to waste time by pointing out to some other examples, but the examples is so much. And I want to end my discussion about some facts, historical facts about Sunni heritage seriously marginalized because of counter trends and saved by imamis because of their neutral position. For example, when speaking about the text Al-Fiqh al-Akbar attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa, we have two versions of that. Al-Fiqh al-Akbar al-Qadim and Al-Fiqh al-Akbar al-Jadid. Al-Fiqh al-Akbar al-Qadim is just preserved in one commentary attributed to Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, Sharh al-Fiqh al-Akbar. And it is rarely preserved in Sunni schools, but we can come across with some quotations and preservation in Shia circles, like the quotation in the Mathalib al-Nawasib of Ibn Shahrashub Mazandarani, a prominent Shia scholar. And further, I'd like to point out to faithful Hanafits school, believing in God's justice and opposing to Ash'ari school, which we can find out very, very useful and valuable information about this school in Kitab Naqv of Abdul Jalil Qazvini Razi, a prominent Shia scholar from Iran in the 6th century AH, 12th century AD. Information which is very valuable and cannot be found in any other resource in mainstream Sunni schools. Finally, I'd like to come to conclusion that any image of Islam without taking Shia in consideration may be incomplete and even misleading. Studying Shia is an inevitable part of Islamic studies to complete both data and analysis in any field. Then, in the way of studying in different fields and cases of Islamic study, we can use techniques such as visualization, perspectivation, and detection of external material to use Shia material and Shia frameworks to reach a better image and deeper knowledge. Another time, I'd like to underline on the fact that taking in consideration the Shia material and Shia resources in this concern doesn't mean that we confirm all the contents of these resources. It means that we try scientifically and from a neutral position to use the Shia resources and the data given in these resources as complementary data, as complementary content to the content given in the mainstream resources of Sunni schools and Sunni circles, and we believe that Shia resources and Sunni resources can work and can play the role of complementary and supplementary means for each other in any historical research. In the end of my participation, many thanks for your time and your attention, and I prepared for any kind of comments and discussions. Thank you.